Thank you, Karen, and I'm really happy to be here to discuss this important topic. And I'm going to focus on what digital databases and fugitive advertisements can tell us about the transatlantic slave trade. I'll explore the wealth of information that these sources can provide on the backgrounds and cultural practices of enslaved peoples, providing us with a more capacious understanding of some of the key SQA themes. So yeah, these key themes, I'm keen to hear your thoughts about whether you use such databases in your teaching or any other online primary sources and the challenges of using such sources, but also the challenges of teaching transatlantic slavery in general and what students seem more interested in. So the talk today will touch on a little bit about the wealth of ports, but more thinking about issues such as the fair revolt, racism, prejudice. I will place a lot of weight on African societies, so European factories, the development of states and economies based on transatlantic slavery, the destruction of societies, and also the role of African societies in continuing the trade, but also like to focus on resistance within African societies. So this talk, I'll be focusing on the island of Grenada, which is a tri-island state. So there's mainland Grenada, but also Carriacou to the north and Petite Martinique there too, which is in the southeastern Caribbean. So why study the ethnic backgrounds and cultural lives of enslaved peoples? And I'll tie this in with shifts in the teaching of slavery and historiography. So I would say since the 1960s, there has been new research into the quantitative approaches or focusing on quantitative approaches to the study of slavery. And these are usually concerned with estimating the numbers of enslaved individuals taken from a certain region within Western Africa and focusing on their New World destinations. And the Slave Voyages database, which I'll come back to, has materialized from this approach. Now, these approaches can sometimes obscure the individual experiences of the 12.5 million men, women, and children who were enslaved. And historians working to highlight these individual lives have determined that ethnicity was a significant factor in shaping the relationships between enslaved peoples, as well as the experiences or the relationship between the enslaved and the enslavers. So how did Africans identify themselves? Focusing on ethnic groupings. And this becomes clear when we look at fugitive advertisements, which I will provide examples of and we can discuss together. So these attempts resist the homogenization of Africans. For example, often we may read that Africans sold other Africans, but Africans didn't see themselves as Africans prior to the 20th century. So these labels are problematic. Even ethnicity itself is problematic because one particular ethnic group or ethnic label I'll look at today is the Coromantee. Really, people became Coromantee in the Americas. It wasn't a label used by West Africans from present-day Ghana to describe themselves. But these labels can tell us much about the individual experiences in African societies. So an examination of ethnicity can add detail to the SQA points, such as fair revolt. Some ethnic groups were seen as more prone to revolt than others, and indeed the Coromantee is a case in point. And it can tell us much too about racism and prejudice, not just based on racial categories, but also ethnic differences. Another reason why focusing on the backgrounds of enslaved peoples are so important, because it reflects a shift in the teaching of slavery and the historiography to move away from the noun slaves, which can reinscribe commodification, to enslaved, stressing a process or traumatic event that occurred to enslaved peoples, but did not erase their identity and their agency. And this shift has provoked more examinations of their ethnic and cultural particularities. Also focusing on resistance, specifically cultural resistance, enlarges our understanding of enslaved resistance more broadly, which is a topic especially looked at as it concerns abolition in 1807. Some perspectives on this topic may privilege successful resistance in the form of slave revolts, which prompts the notion that not all enslaved peoples could resist. So it's important to show there's a distinction between overt resistance, an action that will threaten the plantation, such as rebellion or burning a plantation house, or covert resistance, attempts made by enslaved peoples to slow down or weaken the plantation. So looking at this way, we can see every enslaved person could and did resist in some way. In some form, they slowed down the plantation system or created some temporary reprieve from it. Also, sources are important. Studying the backgrounds and identities of enslaved peoples requires use of other sources, and digital sources can help there. So as I mentioned, the Slave Voyages database has stimulated research into African backgrounds, which ports, which African societies dominated at particular times, and their New World destinations. So understanding this can really enlarge what we know about European factories on the West African coast, the development of slave-based states and economies, destruction of societies, etc. And also considering sources, what I'll draw on today is fugitive advertisements, sometimes called runaway advertisements. There's a runaway slave database done by colleagues here at the University of Glasgow, focusing on the UK. Here, and even with the Caribbean databases, which are evident or appear in the Caribbean newspapers via the British Library, and has a list of digital sources there. These advertisements were published by enslavers, but they were generated by the actions of enslaved peoples. So this is important to note too. And culture as a source, right, as an alternative form of archive, can tell us much about this topic too. So the particular cultural tradition I'll be looking at today is nation dance. So there's a couple of resources there, including the MOOC that Karen mentioned earlier, the history of slavery in the Caribbean, done by academics in the Department of History, Future Learn course. So we know from the Voyages database that 12.5 million enslaved peoples were taken across the Atlantic. And this database has details of 36,000 voyages from the late 16th century to the mid 19th century. And you can trace where the voyage began. So in Britain, identify Scottish ports, for example, and which places in Africa, which American destinations. So it can be used to trace the geographical origins of enslaved peoples in any given territory, such as Grenada. The main data set contains thousands of names of ship owners and ship captains, but unfortunately does not contain names of the millions who were enslaved. However, there is an African names database on the website. So here's a Slave Voyages database. It's open access, free to use. There are several sort of data sets. This is the African names database, and this one, the Inter-American, shows the movement of enslaved peoples within the Americas. But the transatlantic one is the focus today. So there are within that two databases as well, one based on called the database, actual records that have survived. And this allows to be more specific with the ports and New World destinations. But there's also this estimate database, which is where the 12.5 million figure comes from, which also accounts for records that have been destroyed or incomplete. But the database, so click on the database, and then I'll focus on the island of Grenada. So that would be the place of landing. And then I'll turn to seeing it in table form. And what you can do here as well is observe change over time. So we know that the mid to late 18th century saw a record number of enslaved peoples being captured. And also you can look at the Pacific areas of embarkation. And this is what I will focus on today. So happy to go through that with you again. I always have to pause when I do it because you select in the right category, etc. So this is where the chart comes from here. And so we can see around 140,000 enslaved peoples were sent to the island of Grenada. So I use that information I simplify that information. So that means a third roughly of captives were sent from the Bight of Biafra, and these are coastal points on the region within the West African coast, and 21% were sent from the Gold Coast, and I'll focus on the Gold Coast today. So the Grenadian data demonstrates some of these trends over time, these geographical breakdowns. There is and we know that because of colonization, because the British were the predominant ship exporter of enslaved peoples during this time, and to Grenada and the British Caribbean, we know that predominantly British ships were being used, including one from Greenock in 1764. So this can be used to trace individuals who are involved in several aspects of the slave trade. It can also tell us about the development of ports in Britain. We know that Scots were active in the British Caribbean, and they came to dominate the ceded islands, Grenada, Carriacou, St. Vincent, from the 1760s onwards. So there's a little background there. So the patterns of these Grenadian bound ships, specifically their regional preferences and the concentration of arrivals during the mid to late 18th century impacted the formation and character of cultural traditions of the island. This encouraged the formation of groups based on ethnic, linguistic, and cultural similarities, which were known as nations. These nations were not homogeneous. They could involve peoples that spoke different languages, but they were generally based on similarities, ethnic, linguistic, or cultural. So categories such as a Coromantee, which I'll focus on today, were meaningful for both the enslaved and the colonial elite. In the 19th century, there's an account of Africans in Grenada practicing dances based on these nations during the week and also on Sundays. And these counter the idea that slavery was social annihilation, that slavery extracted individuals from relationships. It did that, but they were also able to recreate meaningful relationships in the Americas, relationships that involve belonging. So this was put forward by a American sociologist in the 1980s and has been criticized by particularly historians. There's a large body of work that has generated looking at how enslaved peoples formed these relationships in the New World. And one of the fascinating ways is nation dance. So I've got a picture of nation dance on the right there from Carriacou. Nation dance was actually, the study of it was actually pioneered, the academic study, by a Scottish sociologist, Andrew Pearce, in the 1950s. He, along with other ethnomusicologists, later identified 9 nations where enslaved Africans belonged to, which enslaved Africans belonged to in the 17th and 18th century: Coromantee, and the Igbo, Manding, Chamba, Congo, Arada, Temne, Moko, Banda, but we're focusing on the Coromantee. It's also interesting to note that there's another source that you may find interesting, musicalpassage.org, which explores the songs of particular nations in Jamaica. It also has features musicians who reenact these musical traditions. So the Coromantee is also a significant nation in Jamaica. So nation dance is held to commemorate important life events, as well as ill health, ill fortune. It's conducted in a circle, and enclosed within that circle are drummers, usually men, and singers who are usually women. There's several warm-up songs to appeal to their ancestors. And the first nation that performs is usually the Coromantee, again, reflecting the dominance of enslaved people sent through the ports of the Gold Coast. At the end of the ceremony, often secular dances are performed, mainly for entertainment. Interestingly, and this is something that I need to find out more about, there's a dance called Scotch Igbo. So it's a combination of Scottish influence, but also the Igbo ethnic group from the Bight of Biafra, present-day Nigeria. It's not a main dance, but certainly reflective, tells us something about the Scottish presence in that island. So during slavery, cultural activities such as drumming and dancing were prohibited. It was believed that it would encourage enslaved peoples to rebel. For example, at drumming ceremonies, it was noted that fugitives will come down from the woods and interact with enslaved peoples on their estates, executing plans for rebellion. And indeed, prior to the Fedon Rebellion in 1795, it was noted that the free mixed population of African and European descent used to interact with enslaved peoples at drumming ceremonies, encouraging them to rise up. The Fedon Rebellion is interesting, 18th century, occurring 4 years after the beginning of the Haitian Rebellion in 1791. Similar themes, the role of free coloreds, this uprising involving thousands of enslaved peoples. It lasted 15 months, the Fedon Rebellion, and made significant damage to the plantation society. And the historian Michael Cratton says that by the beginning of 1796, Grenada was a Black republic under arms, with St. George, its capital, the single imperial enclave. So it's interesting to connect drumming with more overt forms of resistance, such as rebellion. And drumming is sort of everyday or covert forms of resistance. So it was a large-scale rebellion, and it's been described the closest equivalent in the English Caribbean to the Haitian Revolution. And there's work on how important the Haitian Revolution was in impacting revolts in the British Caribbean, in Grenada, for example, the Fedon Rebellion, and how British Caribbean rebellions were interlinked. So the Barbados Rebellion of 1816, the Demerara Rebellion of 1823, and the Jamaica Rebellion of 1831, and how this impacted the abolition of slavery. So I could definitely recommend the work of Gillian Matthews there. So focusing back on the Coromantee, looking at nation, we know that those labeled as Coromantee forcibly embarked in present-day Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, and were named Coromantee. The Gold Coast was closer to the Americas, so ships could stop at various European establishments on their way to other ports and buy captives. And the Gold Coast, and gold was a major export from the Gold Coast until it was eclipsed by enslaved peoples in the late 17th century. And by the first decade of the 18th century, political rivalries on the Gold Coast had provoked a number of wars, and the resulting turbulence resulted in the capture of African men, women, and children at sail at the coast. And so most enslaved peoples left the region, embarking on Elmina, Cape Coast. We know important castles that were holding cells, prisons for enslaved peoples. There was also a Dutch port at Coromantee, which is significant because enslaved peoples from the Gold Coast were named Coromantine after this port. I'm not sure if this is on the map here or the other map. Yeah, it's on this earlier map, the Coromantine there. Sorry, it's quite blurry. So in finding more out, in looking at the Gold Coast, the interior of the Gold Coast, we can see that the extraction of enslaved peoples was related to the warfare between various Akan states. So states where people spoke similar languages, but they did not see themselves as unified. Several Akan states were destroyed, such as the Dechera, Gonja, Achem, from, within the 18th century. And from the beginning of the 18th century, Ashanti Empire, an Akan state, rises and asserts its dominance during this time. So by the mid-18th century, the Akan Wars had devastated the region, thereby accounting for the high numbers of enslaved peoples pushed out from this region. It's also important to say that, and I've noticed in the SQA points here, but also in the historiography on the Atlantic slave trade, that there's often a neglect of so-called people in so-called stateless or decentralized societies. So societies that were different from Ashanti, which I just mentioned, Oyo, Congo, and Dahomey, these centralized societies. In that, so what I would note is that a quarter of people on the eve of colonial rule in the 19th century, late 19th century, lived in stateless or decentralized societies, governed by chiefs or a council of elders. Scholars have debunked the idea that within these societies were simply just prey for larger centralized societies, and that these stateless societies or decentralized societies weren't able to mount effective resistance. So a more balanced perspective on African societies during the transatlantic slave trade would explore the range of strategies used to stop or limit the slave trade by these decentralized societies, whether it's attacks from the coast. There's a case where they attacked Europeans from the coast, even kidnapping Europeans, ransoming Europeans, but also strategies by societies or families to redeem friends and family who were caught up, who were enslaved, and also building defensive structures. So there's a wealth of information on the links there. So Coromantee, I mentioned, coming from the interior of the Gold Coast, and we see the Coromantee as an ethnic label produced in fugitive advertisements. We know the Coromantee were also dominant in several revolts in the British Caribbean, such as the Taki Revolt in 1760 in Jamaica, and in the formation of the Jamaican Maroons. So this is an advertisement noting the sale of enslaved peoples from the Gold Coast region, and they reference the Coromantee, the Fanti, who are a southern ethnic group, the Ashanti Kingdom, and the Akim. So all these were Akan-speaking peoples apart from the Fanti. Now, nation dance in Karaku, Coromantee is a key nation that I mentioned. It's the first group which opens up the ceremony. And you can find listings of Coromantee in the Grenadian and British Caribbean newspapers, including a notice in April 1798 of an imprisoned French-speaking captured fugitive named Kodjo. Now, Kodjo is a dominant, a significant Akan surname in present-day Ghana, but also in Grenada and many other territories of the British Caribbean. So it's an Akan name. And we know that Kodjo spoke French, presumably he also spoke English and an Akan language. He was captured by the militia. And we know that fugitives could be resold if they were not claimed. There's also an example from Jamaica. So a fugitive person known as Angelica from the Coromantee country. And in terms of the shift in language that I mentioned earlier, slave, enslaved, also there's been a shift, using fugitives or freedom seekers, because you often see runaway advertisements in newspapers contiguous to advertisements of runaway horses. And so again, this commodification piece. And also noting, I should note that the term freedom seekers is not unproblematic, because enslaved people sought freedom in different ways. Simon Newman, and I can share this resource, has written an interesting paper on how enslaved peoples ran away, sometimes to other estates, joining their families, joining still that system of enslavement, so not escaping from slavery, but freedom to them meant being with family, even if it was under the plantation. So Angelica here from the Coromantee country, we could deduce that her enslaver was a woman, formerly the property of Miss Nancy Andrews, or her past enslaver was a woman. She sold milk. Was this for the enslaver, or does this tell us something about Angelica's marketing skills, perhaps using that money to save for her freedom? But she ran away. Wench is noted here, also a derogatory term used to refer to enslaved women. She was branded on the right shoulder. Perhaps ES represents the name of her original enslaver. She was harbored in an enslaved person's yard, a so-called Negro yard. And so again, this emphasizes, this may hint to the idea that I expressed earlier, that Angelica may have run away to a person's yard who was also enslaved. So one more, and I think this one is interesting because it also tells us who enslaved peoples ran away with. So Olive of Coromantee, which is, I think, the second to last paragraph, took away her child named Bessie, about 3 years old. So by tracing the Coromantee through these newspapers, we get a sense of who these enslaved peoples were and the actions they took to secure freedom, or their vision of freedom. So to this end, digital databases and fugitive ads fills in the gaps of our knowledge of the transatlantic slave trade. We can use it to trace the journeys of bonded people and gaining a good understanding of their displacement within Western Africa, the effect the traffic wreaked on their societies. Understanding their African backgrounds also tells us something about their New World experiences. The Coromantee, for example, were important in warfare, in slave revolts in several British Caribbean societies, and their cultural traditions are diverse too, are notable too. And there's often this focus, as I mentioned, I think before, on African collaboration, focusing on African states who collaborated with European slave traders, such as, the key states, Ashanti, I mentioned Oyo, Dahomey, Congo. But yet there is a story of resistance within Africa that should be emphasized. And one way of doing that is looking at the decentralized or so-called stateless societies and their actions. And in the Americas, also resistance took various forms, such as the creation of nations and nation dance tradition that I've described. Even though some of these labels were invented by the British as a way of categorizing and identifying those who escaped from slavery, the adoption of such labels by enslaved people shows us that ethnicity was meaningful for enslaved peoples themselves and was used to resist commodification, uniting too with other groups who had different experiences, languages. So it allowed them to assert their distinctiveness, but also unite with other groups. So nation dance, this cultural tradition, is a form of historical knowledge. It tells us about the ways in which enslaved peoples were able to resist racial slavery through the formation of new diasporic identities and relationships, which drew on their African experiences. So I'll end there, and I'm interested in asking questions, answering questions, and finding out whether you've used these databases, what databases you used, and how it's helped in the understanding of the transatlantic slave trade.